Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Carly Urbanski, and I am one of the joint heads of the Bristol Aging Better program. And this workshop is part of a series of 50 workshops, all about co-production with Aging Better programs. And today's learning comes from specifically the Aging Better programs in Bristol and Torbay. And the purpose of today's workshop is to share our learning and recommendations about co-production in a research setting based on all of our experiences in Torbay and Bristol. We held a webinar in February, which was really popular, and there were lots of questions from the audience. So we decided to hold this workshop as a follow-up to give more time to dig a little bit deeper into some of the aspects of the co-research. And this webinar specifically focuses on one area of our learning, which was the support needed for the researchers. Some of you will probably have attended that webinar, while others might have just watched the recording online. But don't worry if you haven't seen it, as we'll be covering different content today anyway. And you can always watch the recordings back from the one in February. So as I said, today we will be looking at different content to the webinar we held in February. Today, we will first give you some key thoughts and reflections pulled together by our volunteer researchers. These points showcase some of our key learning from the experiences, and then we will split up into 3 breakout rooms. Each breakout room will dig further into a theme related to co-produced research, and those themes are recruitment of volunteer researchers, ethical and safeguarding considerations when doing co-research, and scope of influence in decision-making. So Claire, who's a part of the BAB team, will be assigning everybody to the different breakout rooms so that you'll get assigned when you need to go in. And then we'll come back together to briefly share some key points from each of the breakout rooms. All the content today will be recorded, so this main session is recorded as well as each of the breakout rooms. So you'll have a chance to be able to watch the other breakout rooms afterward if you weren't able to be a part of that today. And the recordings will be publicly available, uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So the breakout rooms will be your main time today for questions during this workshop. We don't have lots of times for questions after we return from the breakout room because they'll just be the main facilitators feeding back a few points. But don't worry, because we have a panel discussion later today, which some of you might already be signed up to. That's this afternoon, and that will be your chance to ask more questions. And as you'll see on the slide, we have the details of that, and that'll be starting at 3 o'clock. And then after today, further content will be made available in the form of our toolkit, and this will launch at the end of the month and contains loads of learning about co-production, including a whole toolkit about co-production in a research setting. So thank you again for being here today, and we hope you get so much out of it. And I'll now hand over to Claire for the first part of the workshop.
Thank you, Carly. So my name is Claire. I'm the Learning Officer for Bristol Aging Better. I'll just move on to the next slide. So to start off this workshop, we just wanted to share some of our key learning points and reflections about co-production in research. So these reflections come from our volunteer researchers themselves. In Bristol, we call them community researchers, and in Torbay, they're called citizen evaluators. And we've got quite a lot of them on the call with us today. So this is sort of, if we had to do it in a nutshell, these are the key sort of bits of learning really and reflections that we wanted to share with you. So number one being that your approach to co-research needs to be underpinned by remembering that the role is voluntary, as in both Bristol and Torbay it was. In some cases it's not, but on the whole, these roles do tend to be voluntary. So just remembering, if it is voluntary, that's the case. But even if it's not, that each individual will have their different motivations and their interests for getting involved. So remembering that point will influence other factors and other things to remember if you're doing co-production research. So I'll just go through these now. The first ones are being the need to be flexible in the roles and the tasks that the researchers take on. So if possible, trying to give the volunteer researchers a large amount of choice about what they do and how they do it. So that might involve providing training if someone wants to do something but they're new to it or they lack confidence. And it also works to provide choice about who they work with. So for example, offering them the chance to work on something alone if that's what they would prefer, but also in pairs or in small groups if that's a better way of working for them. And a large part of this being flexible is trying to be creative about how people are involved, making sure they can get involved at the level that's comfortable for them and the time commitment that works for them as well. And this flexibility involves expecting and planning for volunteer turnover. So while you may have your project being a certain length of time, and you may try and encourage the researchers to stay for that full length of time, interest varies over time, circumstances change, and so it's good to be prepared for your team of volunteer researchers to have some turnover and the size to vary over time. And it might be that people want to step away for a bit and then later come back, and that's fine too. So another key reflection is around the training and support that you provide. So we covered this in quite a lot of detail in our February webinar, and that was the main focus of the webinar. So we're not going to touch on this too much today. However, I do want to play just a short audio clip from one of our community researchers, Jenny, which I think just sums it up quite nicely for those who either couldn't attend in February and haven't yet watched the recording. I'll just play that for you now.
I was so grateful for the heavy lifting done by office staff at Bristol Aging Better and our academics. From the production of either paper or digital copies of documents on request and booking meeting rooms, to making initial contacts with research participants where appropriate, drafting outlines for reports and presentations where we were invited then to add our own contributions, and providing timely ongoing critiques to fine-tune our research. This support left me free to focus on doing what I signed up for, to make a useful contribution to the research project itself.
So as I say, that just sort of briefly sums it up. But the main emphasis in terms of training and support is to make sure you have a budget for it, and that if you want to provide high quality support, then it does take time as well. So have some staff resource and staff time to be able to provide that. Our third key reflection is around the academic or research steer. So the beauty of having sort of flexibility and freedom within the role also needs to be balanced with having enough of a steer, really, in terms of from professional researchers or academics, so that then the volunteer researchers feel supported rather than overburdened. And part of this steer involves being really clear about the purpose of each research task, the kind of key outputs that need to be produced, and the audience that anything you produce will be aimed towards, because that really then helps direct the research. And it also involves supporting volunteer researchers to recognise the difference between fact and opinion, and how each of those can inform the research in different ways. So when you're immersed in the research process, especially if you're new to it and don't have a background in this, which most people don't, then it can sometimes be hard to differentiate between the two, and that can be a really supportive kind of steer that's provided to volunteer researchers. And we also found that providing ongoing feedback is so important, and we sort of refer to these as feedback loops, really. So this one feedback loop is to provide ongoing feedback about the quality and the content of the research. So, for example, helping the volunteer researchers to reflect on how an interview went, what they could maybe do differently next time, and who they're not reaching in the research, just having that kind of sounding board, really, from a research perspective, to constantly give feedback and improve. But also have a feedback loop about keeping volunteer researchers informed about how their work is used. So sort of who it's been shared with, any actions taken as a result, how it's informed any decisions, and the impact of that. And then our last reflection that we wanted to share in this sort of opening section of the workshop is just around having a social element to the role as well. So we found in Bristol and Torbay that strong bonds between the volunteer researchers can really improve the quality and enjoyment of the role. So really important to kind of build those social opportunities in, really, and it's so much harder to do that when we're not face to face, but really try to kind of get those friendships to develop through sort of just natural opportunities to spend time together, because that can play a part in volunteer researchers, their enjoyment of the role and sort of keeping them involved over time. But it also helps to improve the quality of the research, because they can provide support to each other, and can challenge each other as well, because if they feel comfortable around each other, then they can feel comfortable challenging each other, which helps to improve the research. So that is a sort of whistle-stop tour of the key reflections our volunteer researchers pulled together. All of these in different ways influence the themes that we're going to discuss in the breakout rooms. So I'll hand back to Carly just briefly before we go into the breakout rooms. But yes, I guess with the breakout rooms, I would just like to say I know we've asked you all your preferences, so we're trying our best to kind of accommodate those preferences. But as Carly said, they are all being recorded. So if you're not able to go into your breakout room of your first choice, or actually if you just want to watch the others back because you're keen on all of the topics, then that will be available to you in the recording. So I'll hand back to you, Carly.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so like Claire mentioned, again, all of the sessions will be recorded. And in each of the breakout rooms, when you get into the room, you'll see a slide that the facilitators will pull up that will have the questions on there to help us kind of lead through the talking points. So you don't have to remember anything right now because it'll all be there, and there'll be a facilitator who's going to help kind of guide the conversation and take notes as well, so we can be the ones who feedback after all. So, and they are quite small groups, so it's nice because we'll all be able to have a chance to share and ask questions and share any future plans as well. So yeah, Claire, are we ready?
Yeah, the breakout rooms are ready. So I'll send you off now, and you'll be in breakout rooms for about 30 minutes. And then we'll come back to the main room to share what we discussed and to kind of close the workshop then. Okay. See you all in 30 minutes.
So seniors and carers, the caring community will be either caring for an older person or over 60 themselves. But across the whole range of the very diverse communities that are in Southwark. And we're trying to do specific outreach to lesbian, gay communities, Latin American communities, and some of our more communities that maybe don't always get connected to projects. And we particularly want to have citizen researchers from all backgrounds and all educational backgrounds, and get a real good mix of people. And we have talked about involving younger people as peers, supporters, mentors, students working alongside us. So we're really hoping that it's going to be a complete mixture of people.
And that would be great, like you said, to get the different experiences, opinions, thoughts, and ideas, because then you have as diverse of a project as possible, and all that creativity in there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Margaret, did you want to say something?
And just to say that we operated completely differently in Torbay. We were working with Plymouth University, who were evaluating all the various different projects that were being funded through the National Lottery. And we almost sort of kept our distance from Ageing Well because we were doing a very separate evaluation. So rather than getting very involved with them, we did interviews of people who were affected or had been funded by various different projects. Some of these were carried on for several years, so we were following people through to see the long-term effects. So it was a very different setup in the Bay. And I think some of what the community researchers have done in Bristol, that work was actually carried on in Torbay by our community builders who were actually employed as a part of the project. And we had them in every single ward in the Bay, so they knew the area and the people and embedded themselves really in those areas. So that was interesting, and we were doing work on looking at their role, but unfortunately we were just ramping that up when COVID hit, and we couldn't do the interviews that we were hoping to do with them because they then got very involved in the actual support on the ground for those who were shielding, and particularly those over the age of 55.
and then that's a shame how much it was stunted from that, wasn't it? But yeah, it was really different, wasn't it? The projects between Torbay and Bab, Bristol work. But yeah, I mean, in terms of being a part of the community, does anybody have any other thoughts on how they feel if you'd be too close to the community, if it's better to be more immersed in the community? Any thoughts or opinions about that? Or questions about how it worked? And you guys can feel free to not have yourself on mute as well, because this can be an open discussion. We want to make sure that you can all ask questions so we can answer them really.
I think that's really linked to this question about what you actually want to achieve by having co-produced research, because obviously it depends on what kind of research, what the purpose of it is. It counts as, you know, how close you have to be into the community or not.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, Jan?
I don't know that I do, but I'd be interested in other people's reflections on that, or whether it is something you're interested in or not.
I think it's interesting when if you're looking at people who are actually going to be going out and researching within their community, is if you decide beforehand what you want to achieve, but ensure that you don't have that set in stone, so that if things change, you can move with it, so that you're reacting. Because if you're too rigid, then you're not opening yourself out to everything, all those possibilities, all those needs. Because this is, if you're doing research, you're looking at people's needs and how you're going to respond to those and how you're going to improve people's life and outcomes. So make sure when you're recruiting people that you know they know what you're looking for, but that you also tell them that you're open to things changing, sort of morphing and altering as you go along. I think that's really important, that you're not stuck in something too rigid.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's probably something. I don't actually remember our initial recruitment documents, and maybe Jan would, but I just think we didn't advertise that way. I just think when we all went into the Aging Better program, you kind of had a thought of what it was going to be, what the evaluation was going to be, but it changed so much over the program. The roles changed, and I think, yeah, that is key when you're recruiting, to make sure that it is spelled out, that it needs to be fluid, like you said, Margaret, because yeah, you have to be able to kind of adapt in this world. I think that was one of the big benefits of the Aging Better funding, was that the lottery let us have that fluidity to the whole program. So even with the projects run, the projects could adapt and change, but the evaluation also needed to adapt and change. So it was one of the benefits, but it also, not everybody works that way. So not everybody feels comfortable in that kind of position. So that's definitely key to make sure that is in the initial recruitment documents as well. And when we're talking about, because obviously we have some other questions here as well that we can delve into, but in terms of involving a diverse range of people as well, I know some of the things that we thought about, because all the different Aging Better areas did it differently. But, you can think about things like, is it voluntary or paid? Are all of the researchers involved in all of the same tasks, or do you break them down differently? Also, even just to what they're called, we had different names in different Aging Better areas as well. And I think, one thing that we've found on reflection is that, if the name kind of reflects the job, that makes the most sense. One of the other Aging Better areas had what, we called them community researchers in Bristol, but they had story catchers. And when we all came together and talked about that, we thought that was a nice name, but maybe that reflects more to somebody who's just building up case stories and having, talking to people who are telling their story. But as well, maybe community researchers sounds more of kind of a clinical term and more evaluation term. And not everybody would like that as well. So I guess, when we talk about naming the role, that has probably a big part to play in who sees that advertisement and who's interested in that. But it'd be great to get some thoughts on that as well. Maybe, I don't know if Margaret, if you want to give a couple thoughts from Torbay.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think when the ads went out for our one and our initial meeting, because this had never been done before, I don't think it was made quite clear enough precisely what we were going to be doing. And I think we would have had a greater uptake, and we would in future, sort of learning from, the experience. But to know that you were going to be interviewing people, that you were going to be building up questionnaires, that you're going to be trained in ethics, interview techniques, all that sort of thing. I'd only just retired and I was looking for something that was going to stimulate the brain, keep me going. And I found it absolutely fascinating, the actual training side of it. And we did, when we were working out our interviews and the questions for our interviews, we went into role play mode, and that was when our group really bonded, because all of a sudden quite shy people took on another persona and turned into someone completely different, which was great fun. But learning how to do different types of questioning, that empathy that you need. And I think this was the interesting thing for a lot of us, was we were working with professional researchers, but we had a very different reaction of those that we were interviewing than they would have had to a professional researcher, because we weren't trained professionally, but we brought, I think, a warmth to an interview, which meant that those people opened up a lot more. So that was really interesting. And we then had to do the reports, and the reports go to the researchers, and then they get the case studies get written up, and then they go off to the lottery. So although we weren't doing research ourselves, we did have, it was, an important role as far as we were concerned.
Yeah, definitely. And how, can I ask, did you have anybody who then, after a few weeks or months, oh, sorry, can everybody hear me? Just wondering if anybody dropped out because of the expectations of what the role was supposed to be, or if they felt that it was, not what they wanted based on the recruitment documents.
No, we did have people drop out, but that was because of personal reasons. Sort of someone suddenly had to take on a caring role for a mother who suddenly became very ill. We unfortunately lost one person, and that was gutting, because he was a real part of the team, and sort of he developed cancer and died within 3 months of diagnosis. But then we got a couple of new people, and then we sort of had to meld those into the team. But when we were doing the interviewing, we worked in pairs, so and wasn't necessarily always the same two, because it would depend on availability. But it was a strong team, and we've made friendships, which is great. There were only a couple of us who knew each other before, this process began, but we've actually, sort of made friendships, which once again, when you leave the workplace and you've suddenly lost your work colleagues, to make new friends out in your community is important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's what so many people are looking for, aren't they? Which is so important. And I don't know how it was in Torbay, but in Bristol, we had recruited right away as part of the BAB program. So our researchers had started before the project started. And I don't know if Jan will be able to add to this as well, but I think, we've looked at, was that the right time? When do you recruit? You know, is it better to wait until projects have started? Do you want to be there from day one? Again, I think a lot of this comes down to just being open and honest in the recruitment papers and what you're expecting of people. Because I think there was a long wait for our researchers, and we might have done that differently, knowing what we know now. But I don't know if Jan had any comments on that as well.
Yeah, I think that certainly some of the first group of people who recruited, I think some dropped out because they were expecting to kind of get on almost straight away with doing something. And I think with the doing something, a lot of expectation was that we will be interviewing older people. And in fact, in the research, it took a long time. And for some of the group, they didn't. They did a lot of interviews, but it was with people providing the services rather than the people receiving the services, which I think, again, is an issue about expectation and what's possible within the research. So certainly there is a time thing. I mean, I think to some degree our involvement was perhaps unusual in how long we were involved. I think, you know, a lot of research projects are much more specific and will be much more short term. But I mean, alongside this question of recruitment is of course retention and how you're going to retain people.
Yeah, definitely how you engage with them. And I think, I mean, obviously you can comment on from Bristol's point of view as well. But I think that's where, you know, we had, I mean, I feel like we had strong relationships between UWE and the researchers and the BAB team. We always made sure we connected and worked closely together where we could. And I think, and maybe there's ways we could have done that differently, but obviously you need that to have that momentum. I think that's one of, you know, the aspects of this that has come up is how do you actually maintain that momentum once you've recruited people, you've gotten them in, they know what the role entails, but why do they want to stay? You know, what's in it? Why, what keeps them interested and happy in this role and learning and growing? And that comes from, again, like we talked about and like Claire mentioned in the wider group, the budget and making sure you have that. And I think a lot of the Aging Better areas seem to do that well. I know Bristol had a decent budget where we could have UWE supporting. So we always made sure that there was a staff member who from BAB's side and from UWE's side were supporting the researchers, working with everybody so that it was, you know, as much open communication as possible, really.
I'm just wondering whether there's anyone else in the group now who's perhaps come along with any particular questions about recruitment or about volunteer research who might want to ask them before we have to go back into the main session.
Yeah, because we only have about 5 minutes left, so this is a chance to ask questions from us.
I think I've got a slightly different issue in Southwark in that we got very short-term funding, no research partner working alongside us, impact of last year of COVID. So we've got a short period to try and train, support people, co-produce some projects, get it going, get the field research going, get the reporting done. So it's interesting when you were talking about maintaining momentum, because I know from listening to Jill and reading the stuff around Bristol, you know, these are long, 5-year projects, fantastically resourced, which is great. I suppose for me, it's about how do I keep retention going in the sense that it's short-lived. I mean, already a couple of the carers have said, well, Barb, if it ends in December, what's next? You know, what's going to happen? So I'm trying to already think about bodies, groups that might support a group of seniors and carers that are keen, excited, want to do citizen research and where they'll be hosted or looked after once our little pot of funding ends. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? It's sort of, because people get motivated to do things for different reasons at different times, but there's nothing worse than being asked to do something and feel that it doesn't have any meaning or continuation. And I know from listening to Jill after the Bristol experience for her, I know she's gone on to do other things in terms of having a role, which I think was with care and repair, actually. Emma might know that. but yeah, so I don't know what people's thoughts are on, I mean, our brief is going to be very much around being age friendly, what it takes for Southwark to be age friendly. So it's a very broad brush. It's not just health and social care, it's much wider than that. So I think, you know, we could do research on place, regeneration, pollution, traffic, transport, housing, you know, there's a whole raft of things. But yeah, keeping people engaged. I mean, I don't know if there's any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I suppose one thought is if it's quite broad, the possibilities of this subject is whether there's any particular agendas locally that are important to feed into.
Yes.
And the other thing is whether there's any particular interest that your volunteers have that they want to take forward. I mean, you know, one of the motivations for me in getting involved in Age UK was because of the subject of loneliness, and I was very interested in loneliness.
Yeah, certainly I've done a lot of research about what the current thinking is, where strategies are at. Loneliness has re-emerged as a big issue, obviously what happens post-COVID. So yeah, there's some very good initiatives and strategies around that we can link into. And you're right, I mean, we're only starting the training tomorrow. The initial phase is saying to people, you know, what are you interested in? What's your passion about? And then seeing if we can get some crossover. I mean, I really like, Margaret, your idea of doing stuff in pairs, but not being the same pair all the time, having a, you know, who's available, having that flexibility. So yeah, thanks, Jan, that's helpful.
Does anybody else have any questions before we move back into the other room?
Oh,
can you not hear me?
We can't hear you, Carly. Well,
yeah.
I'm so sorry about this. I'm sorry. There we go. My mic is not the best facilitator for this because I'm having mic problems on my computer. We have a minute left. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to ask here of the group about recruitment?
I'm conscious we've only got about 40 seconds, but I had a quick question that I put in the chat about people's experiences of recruiting remotely, whether that's something that you've done or whether all your recruitment happened pre-pandemic. But if it is something you've done, how did you find that? How did it work?
And in Bristol, ours was just pre-pandemic because we've been running for 7 years now. So 7 years ago, actually. So I'm sorry, I can't help with that one.
And Torbay, we're coming to the end of it. So next March is the end of 7 years.
Okay. Yeah,
I've certainly tried to do remotely, Joe, using all of our networks, all of our other groups, trying to, you know, muscle in on Zoom meetings if I can, flyers, phone calls, but it's been very tricky. And the digital inclusion is the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's exactly the same challenge for us as an organisation, that we don't want to just be talking to digitally included people because that's not who is using our services. Okay, thank you very much for those answers.
Is there any last question that we could answer in 30 seconds?
No, well done though. It's fantastic resources that you're sharing. It's good.
Yeah, I think the toolkit will be great because obviously so many more questions will be answered. And if you watch the breakout rooms and just get a bit more information, but there is loads of information here. The toolkits are going to be a massive resource, I think, to so many organizations. So that's where you can kind of sit down and look at all this information, really pick it apart for what that means for where you work. And if you're going to be doing something like this in the future. So definitely have a look at that.
Well, Torbay. So this breakout room really is all about the kind of possible safeguarding and ethical considerations that you need that we need to really just kind of explore when co-producing research. I was just wondering whether we could quickly run around the room just to introduce ourselves and any projects that you're involved in currently or future projects that you're interested in. So should we start with Hannah?
Hiya. So I'm Hannah Guerrero. I'm a Research and Evaluation Manager at Mundo Jumbo, and I'm currently on maternity leave, so I'm not on any projects, which is But generally I do projects with a kind of a qualitative bent. So I've done some co-design, but I'm definitely interested in this session. I don't know whether I actually said that this was the one I wanted to be in, but I was like, please give me this one. Yeah, this is definitely something I'm interested in talking more about and kind of thinking more about the ethical approaches to how you work with different groups.
Fab, brilliant. And Liz?
Hello, I'm a volunteer with a local citizens advice in Warwickshire.
Yeah.
I just want to learn more about co-production, so I'm coming in at a very beginner level.
Cool. Excellent. Francesca?
Oh, hi there.
Hello.
Good afternoon. I'm in the Bristol area. I'm a public contributor across NIHR and all sorts. I don't know if this project just talks the talk without walking the walk, but I'll determine that after our discussion. I see co-production in research as being similar at the very beginning to PICO methodology. If you want to ensure that the research questions are generated because of the interest of the patient, service user and carers and not of the researchers. So we shall see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ben?
Yeah, hi everyone. I've spent many decades working across the voluntary and community sector. I'm now just about to start a PhD into it's really about sort of local governance, and it's really sort of predicated on a co-design model with communities, in fact, in Bristol and Birmingham.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in the sort of links between co-design and action research, and I suppose how, as the question says, how you get the balance to ensure you get a good quality outcome, but that it is also genuinely a process of co-production.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Jan?
Hi, I'm from Bristol Health Partners. So Frank, it's nice to see you. So we have a number of teams who are a mixture of health workers, researchers, public contributors, and wider networks and commissioners. And I think that ethics in particular is seen by some of the teams as an obstacle. It's interesting to hear what you've got to say, and particularly, tips for getting things that have been co-produced through. Thank you.
Okay. Daniel?
Hi everybody, I'm Daniel. I work for a charity in Great Yarmouth called Dial, and as part of my role I also work with Lloyds Bank Foundation as one of their 6 areas in the UK looking at systems change. Particularly in Great Yarmouth at the moment, I'm playing a facilitative role across the system in trying to bring people together to take a service design approach, working with co-production to kind of reevaluate and redesign the homelessness system for Great Yarmouth.
Okay, and Christine?
Oh, hi, I'm Christine. I'm a Bristol Aging Better community researcher, and I've been involved with the programme Bristol Aging Better from the very beginning.
Brilliant, excellent, thank you. Alexa?
Hi everyone, I'm Alexa. I work at the National Citizens Advice Office. I'm a senior user researcher, and more teams are doing co-production, trying it out, and I'm keen to learn more and think about how I might do it in my own research, which is usually focused on our advice content, so the website.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. And finally, Penny.
Yes, hello. I'm Penny. I'm one of the community researchers in Bristol, along with Christine. And like Christine, I've been there since beginning in 2015.
Brilliant, Excellent. Okay, so kind of just to start off with this, this room will run through the questions that Bianca will kind of pop up in a moment, that we've already kind of based this workshop around. So what I'd really like to do is kind of bring in examples that each of you have of co-produced research that you'd be involved with or potentially will be involved with, and I can also add in my reflections on the work in Torbay. Also, I know you know, some of the aspects of what's been happening in Bristol, but also Penny and Christine can add to that too. So should we bring up that first slide, Bianca? Brilliant. Okay, so if we start with safeguarding volunteer researchers, this is really, you know, this is a really important aspect, because although a lot of safeguarding aspects you need to consider in normal research as well, but what are the safeguards that will be kind of put in place for lone working for those volunteers? Has anyone got any contributions for that? No. Okay, so for example, in Torbay, we had a policy of everyone working in pairs, especially if going out to do primary research in groups. We generally never had anyone on their own, and this was mainly due to them working with vulnerable people, but also making sure that everyone was always in a public space, to ensure that to ensure safety as well. I know that in Bristol they had a framework for lone working where they would message someone back in the team. Is that right, Penny?
It is right. We did have a framework, but we never sort of took it to its full extent, really. Yeah. So this is why it's one of the things that we felt were important. In theory, it was all there. We would phone somebody if we were alone, but there was never. What didn't happen was the progression from that, which is what happens if nobody phones. If you're expecting that phone call. And there wasn't clear, at least I wasn't clear, I don't know whether Christine will concur with this, but I wasn't clear who we should phone. Right. And so it's all very well having something in practice, which, but you do need to, if you're going to have lone working, then that does need to be pushed right through to its full extent. The other thing I would say is that we generally did work in pairs, and there was very little visiting at home. So I think this is probably one of the reasons why we didn't sort of get around to doing the whole thing. You know, we left the important bit, the ending, what happens if things go wrong, you know, what the practical steps you take. We didn't pursue that. No. So yes, it needs to be sorted right at the very beginning, in one way or another. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think that's really important. We had, even when our citizen evaluators were working in pairs, we generally always debriefed afterwards, as soon as possible, and that was within kind of 10-15 minutes of the actual research going ahead, and that was often due to, it was to make sure that everything had gone okay and to plan with, because there were a lot of interviews with vulnerable people, to make sure that those vulnerable people were okay. So safeguarding kind of from a safeguarding perspective of the research participants, which we'll go on to later on, but also to make sure that the volunteers were were doing okay as well, because they're quite often really sensitive issues that they were interviewing about and exploring and talking through with people, and to make sure that they felt okay afterwards themselves, and that they didn't, to make sure that they felt that they if they needed additional help or support, or kind of to talk through their feelings and whatnot, that there was someone there to do that. And if we needed to signpost further on, we would do that as well. But generally speaking, we'd always touch base as soon as possible after the kind of research had happened. But I do think that's really important about, you know, having that clear guidance on you know, loan working, who should be called, when should that person be called, and also what to do if on the other end. So if I was the one to be receiving that phone call, you know, what do I do if Penny doesn't call me? What happens then? You know, there needs to be someone else who I can contact to make sure that you're all right as well. Does anyone have anything else they want to add to that at all?
I think it's a good thing to actually, as you said, be very clear at the very beginning of the research, so everyone is clear of what they're going to do, and also to encourage people to follow the guidance.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was away from, I had to go and answer the door quickly. Is there a specific context why volunteers would be on their own that was covered? Sorry, is there particular instances that came up a lot on this project where they had to go out on their own then?
Not for Torbay. We had as part of the University of Plymouth, we have to submit kind of an ethical approval. We have to go through an ethical approval process,
okay.
And that would ensure that we stated in that approval submission that nobody would be loan working, and that everyone would be in pairs, and that there would be a debrief afterwards. And so that was the process that we adhered to. But Penny was saying that, you know, that there wasn't very many times when there were loan work, especially going into people's homes or anything like that.
I'm not sure that anybody went into people's homes.
Yeah.
The loan working, I think, was more my colleagues, other community researchers, going off and doing their own thing, really, which was good.
Yeah.
But as I said, that we hadn't emphasised we had a written statement about the safeguarding in terms of phoning in and so on, but it wasn't adhered to.
Sorry, I don't want to distract us. It's because I went away, but that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah. Should we move on to safeguarding information? So, you know, think about what would happen to the information gathered during co-research. Does anyone have any you know, reflections on that for their own projects? Or I can tell you from a Torbay perspective, we ensured that everything was stored on our university system, which is it's password protected. It adheres to all of our university GDPR guidelines and whatnot. But I'm wondering what happened in Bristol as well.
Christine, do you want to?
I don't think we entirely thought this out thoroughly enough in Bristol. I think we began to get concerned because obviously you might have information on different people's computers. And also if you have papers, etc., can we go into a main office to have them shredded, or someone we can hand those documents to that would keep them safely? Yeah, I don't think we actually thought enough of storing the information, shredding the information through thoroughly enough.
Yeah.
Not at the beginning, and I think this is something that needs to happen at the very beginning of the research, and not be realised that this could become a problem, or there's something that needs to be done a little way through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Torbay, we met very regularly, and always at the end of our, what I tended to do with our meetings would be that I would share documents, but then bring them all back in, so that they could be shredded at the end of the session, so that nobody kind of went home with personal information or documents that they shouldn't necessarily be sharing if they were to get into the wrong hands or whatnot. So yeah, it was the only way that we could do that with hard copies of things, but in general we had a shared site that was secure, so that everyone can access that. Do they have anything else that they want to?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
I don't understand, but was there an independent trial steering committee for this research project that ensured the integrity under the research governance framework, for some of the questions and potential problems that you had? I kind of like thinking, going back to the earlier question, you can have different ways that you engage with people in the same way as you do with mental health. If you're a care coordinator meeting your client for the first time, you meet in the office, then you can make arrangements to meet out in the community with mutual consent, what the patient feels comfortable with. It sounds like as if some things could have been done a little bit easier and not so much onus on the volunteers to have to accept this lone working policy. I'm not saying it was wrong, but I think, hopefully that didn't occur when it was dark and in the winter, and people could have come to a community space where everybody would have felt comfortable. But, these are just quick fire views, and I don't have enough information to be able to really criticize, so I'm not criticizing, they're just observations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I know, so as I said, for the citizen evaluators in Torbay, any research that SARIO does has to be run through the university's ethical approval process, and they have to. It's a really rigorous application form that we have to complete, similar to what you've mentioned about having a trials. Because it's not a trial, we wouldn't have to. It's not something that's not something that we would go through. But the university has a clinical trials separate department that would deal with stuff like that. But for applied research, we still have to run by the university's ethical procedures, but also a number of other bodies that we would seek guidance from to ensure the safety of our volunteers, and the safety and safeguarding information as well. So safeguarding our research participants' information and things like that.
Safeguarding works both ways, so presumably your community researchers, they had DBSs undertaken.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm not sure that was the case in Bristol though. Was it, Penny, Christine? Did you have DBS checks?
I can't remember. I've got DBS for some of the volunteering that I was involved in. I can't remember that. Can I just make the point that the research was approved by the ethics committee at UWE, at the University of the West of England as well. And I think what Christine and Christine will correct me if I'm wrong, I know. I think what we're saying is that a lot of the things that we're talking about today came about in the course of the project. and that is that the fundamentals, as it were there, but there were things that occurred during the course of the project that where we realise in retrospect that wasn't it wasn't done in enough detail, it wasn't emphasised enough, and it wasn't overseen enough. So, for example, we did have to send in reports of research that we'd done to a Safe UE site. So all the reports went there, but there wasn't, the bits that we didn't deal with were the bits of paper that we had at home, and whether we should get that shredded or whether we just leave it on our computer, and things like anonymity on our own computers, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we needed a safe place because we were writing up the reports ourselves. So we needed somewhere where we could store our documents, etc., or our notes of interviews, etc., that we could actually get to them quite easily, and then we could write our reports, and then that could also be saved on that one site. But we did have things like consent forms, etc. We did ask permissions of everyone that we interviewed.
Yeah.
But as we said, I don't remember anybody going into anyone's home. We mainly met in, say, offices or community spaces or just open spaces where there were plenty of other people around.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was during the day. We didn't, as well as I was aware of, we didn't do anything where it was at night time.
No, that was the same in Torbay. I'm just conscious of the time. We've only got 7 minutes left. So Frank has asked, did community research engage with best interest decisions from family members and carers? I know that in Torbay, we certainly were involved, got in contact with family members and carers alongside the individuals that we were doing the research with, and to make sure that everyone was happy. There were a number of occasions where we would be interviewing someone and their husband or wife would be in the same room at the same time, so you had to be really careful about how we engage, but that was always down to the decision of the family member or the carer, and it was a joint decision there.
Can I ask then, was the community researchers qualified to make the correct interpretation that the best interest decision was in the best interest of the person that you actually wanted to engage with? What made them qualified to know that?
Okay. So in what, if you could just provide an example.
Okay. Can you remember, let's say with children, when medical decisions have to be made and parents have got parental responsibility, but the High Court make a best interest decision based on the young child, not what the parents want, because they got life-limiting condition. So people with dementia or don't have mental capacity, you could have a carer that doesn't necessarily look for the best interest, but just gets them involved. So what I'm asking is, you, Donna, or your community researcher, did you actually have training in the Mental Capacity Act 2005 as amended by 2009 to best inform how you went about taking best interest decision by family members and carers?
So what we did was to coordinate all of our research with those people who were supporting them at the time. So in Aging Well Torbay, we had each participant was identified because of being involved in a support program, and it would be that support program who would then recommend that person to be to get involved with our research. We would then speak to that person themselves. We'd speak to we would I don't recall any situation where we were involving people with dementia or severe mental health issues. I don't think there were never, we weren't kind of, it was more looking at Aging Well Torbay as a whole rather than looking at those most vulnerable, and we would never kind of get involved to that level if those individuals weren't capable of taking part in research. And that's all. Informed consent was at the top of our list to make sure that any participant in our research knew what they were getting involved with and had the capacity to provide informed consent.
Do you want me to chip in a little bit from Bristol as well?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, very similar, actually. I mean, the community researchers would not be doing any interviews with anyone who's sort of classed as a vulnerable adult without consent, but also, I mean, a huge amount of our research and what the community researchers were working through was what's called our common measurement framework, which you'll have used in Torbay as well, and that so that is was designed by the national evaluators for Aging Better, ECORIS, and that there was a rule that could not be completed by somebody with a diagnosis of dementia. So even though for anyone, if anyone who might fall into vulnerable adult category, they might be able to fill that in, and all of the questions are optional, so they can fill in as many or as few as they're comfortable with, because some can be quite emotionally triggering for people because they ask questions about loneliness and mental well-being, but they wouldn't be given to anyone with a diagnosis of dementia for that ethical reason.
If we just quickly go on to the last considerations relating to the research methods. So what will happen if volunteers know a participant, or what will volunteer researchers have access to participant contact details? We've kind of touched upon this a little bit about GDPR issues involved in having paperwork or documents that have personal information. We, as a team in Torbay, ensured that if participants were known to our citizen evaluators, we didn't go ahead with that combination of researcher and participant, just to make sure that there were no biases involved, and it just to remove all knowledge of that, otherwise the research is biased. So we just made sure that especially in Torbay, where a lot of people know a lot of people, and everyone does tend to know each other, so it's really it's just really important to make sure that the research is unbiased as possible. Okay, so any more contributions about what will happen if a volunteer knows a participant? No. Penny, Christine?
I don't think it ever arose that, as far as I'm aware. I think that it can depend. I think you have to be aware of that. But I think that it doesn't necessarily, depending on the type of, on the questions you're asking, what you're looking for, I don't think that should necessarily be not be able to take place. Having said that, I mean, I know that one of the other researchers, Jenny, who you might have heard earlier, and I did interview somebody who we did know, because Jenny and I and this guy have been involved in the community sector for the last sort of 20 or 30 years. So, but we weren't sort of intimately connected. We just knew each other. We were acquaintances, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but you need to be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. I think we're just about to close in a moment. If there's any questions that anyone has, please do send them through and we can answer them afterwards.
Really are not used to that, and who I wanted to work with and when, that sort of thing. It was really freeing, I think. So I hope that's helpful in thinking about it. I think in discussing power, you have to look at responsibility as well.
Thank you. Jenny, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think Eddie summed that up pretty much for me as well. I also didn't want that much responsibility. when I signed up for this in 2014. I suppose for me, the co-production is about how far does the organisation who is responsible for the output of the research is prepared to allow the public, i.e. the volunteers, to shape the way that it moves forward, and to be just very transparent about that. And my experience in BAB was just that. I mean, as Eddie said, we had a lot of choice about what we did. There were a couple of bigger projects at the end, which I was involved in, and we were able to have good discussions with our academics to decide the way forward, the research questions we wanted to ask and how to do it. And that for me was the essence of co-production, really.
I guess with some of this, looking back, there were some difficult moments, weren't there, as well? And I just wonder if you've got any reflections on the kind of real points where there were tensions or conflict around matters of, I guess, control of the direction of things and so forth.
I think in the very early days, there was a bit of an issue possibly about transparency. We were working on kind of quite minor projects really before BAB took off in a big way. And they were kind of put to us as a sort of learning experiences. And when we were asking questions about the effectiveness of what we were doing and possibly alternative ways of doing it, that really wasn't taken on board. So that did create a few tensions until we were able to actually openly discuss that. So it comes back to transparency, you know, be very clear with the people that you're working with, what you want them to do and why.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of my reflections on that subject of transparency is that there are quite a few occasions where I don't think anyone really knew what they were doing, and therefore there's an issue there. So there, I mean, I exaggerate, but there are times when there's uncertainty, and I think actually there's uncertainty in the commissioners and in the and this kind of that's quite freeing up potentially, because it creates a space where things can emerge through a lot of discussion, but it can also be quite kind of difficult, I think. And there's a lot of questions where, you know, there are questions about people's time and investment and things that are tried out and then reversed. That can be pretty frustrating. And then it can appear that there are agendas which have just been waiting in the background, which you know, are not revealed. And I think that particularly during the early phases of the programme, there was a lot at stake and a lot of vested interests. So when you're doing an evaluation of programmes, you've got agencies who've got their reputation on the line. And I recall a time when Eddie, for example, you and a colleague did a lot of work with an agency who became quite defensive about what they were doing. So I think that was a real issue.
I think it was. I think within that, I was just thinking about that at this moment. The interesting thing was, in terms of where the lines were, we were actually going to be, it was quite clear there was a lot going wrong with that project. And the responsibility then is, who are we responsible to? What are we, and to what extent are we being critical of BAB in what they're doing? And in fact, there was a meeting that Amy and I had with the project manager at BAB towards the end of it, who said, look, if I've fouled up, just say I've fouled up, you know. It was particularly difficult for me, though, that one, because it was a piece of work that was going on in my bit of Bristol, and I knew some of the people involved. And therefore, I knew that there were the particular agency that had been chosen to run the thing, I felt actually wasn't worthy of running the project.
Yeah. And so things are a lot easier when you're not encountering problems in the field. But when you've got actually, I mean, this was frankly an underperforming project, wasn't it? It really wasn't doing very well at all. and there are real issues about how that information gets shared. I wonder if I could just broaden out the discussion. Would anyone like to throw their hand up or just jump in with an experience and observation that they've got, or a question that they have from someone we haven't heard from yet?
I'll have a go.
Thank you, Ian.
At the moment, I don't say too much. I think just on the issue about where the research takes you, I think there's an issue with commissioners that when you draw up the research, you're doing that from a position of relative ignorance. That's why you want the research, because you want to answer you want answers to some questions that you don't know about or know enough about. And then, of course, one of the good things about co-production often in research is it leads on to other questions that haven't been asked, and they're often the more interesting ones. But the commissioners didn't know that they were more interesting when they commissioned the research. So there's a tension, in other words, between the flexibility, I think, that can be afforded to you to explore some of the nooks and crannies that might not have been anticipated, and sometimes the commissioners' concern about, sticking to the script. I don't think this is unique to co-produced research. I think this is often the way in any kind of research, but I think it brings it to the head, because you do want the people involved in doing the research, the community researchers and the academics, to have a feeling of choice. In fact, Eddie mentioned the word choice, in where you want to go, what you want to do, and what part in the process you want to play. So I think it just helps. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I just think constant communication about the way in which the path which is set out on might be changing en route is essential if you're going to keep the different parties and especially the commissioners involved.
Thank you. Really interesting points. Would anyone else like to come in on this subject? Sarah, are you okay with this subject area?
Yeah, I'm just thinking how relevant this is for me actually at the moment. So I work for Citizens Advice, but I work for a local office in South Wales, but we've been working on a project with Citizens Advice nationally, where we've been kind of mentored by user researchers to come up with innovative ways of solving the kind of the access problems that we've had since COVID has hit, where people haven't been able to come to us in the usual ways. Like drop-in services were very, very popular previously, and now we can't do face-to-face. So we've been doing lots and lots of user research on how we can overcome some of these barriers, basically. And we've started a new research project on. Okay, so there are carers out there that don't realise they're carers, therefore they're missing out on certain entitlements and things like that. So we've started a project on trying to overcome when people come to us, helping them to explore whether or not they are a carer, what their entitlement is. Sorry, I'm going on and on, but I am getting there. And we're right at the start of that, and we're really keen to have a really strong element of co-production in this, but there are lots of givens that we've already been given at the start. There's already been an idea of how we could possibly overcome this. So my colleague and I, who are planning the research project, are trying to think around at what time we should kind of throw it out to more than just her and I. At what stage of this research does it become co-production? And if it's not co-production from the very start, is it just a tokenistic effort to have involvement rather than co-production? So we've got some givens, and we're thinking, is it fair to bring people in knowing that we've got these givens and that the choices might be limited, or do we just go with that anyway and we're just upfront from the start and say, you know, this is what we're looking at and we really need your input on this, if you would join us in it. However, there is an idea already of the direction that the commissioners, I suppose, want us to go in. Yeah, so we're deciding all of that at the moment. So it's really interesting to be part of this discussion. So thank you for having me. It's really nice to hear your takes on it, really.
Thank you, Gary. It sounds really interesting, the work that you're embarking on. I guess one reflection that might come out of this is around trust and trust building. Because often, you know, everyone's making mistakes or, you know, getting things slightly wrong, and without trust, then things can rapidly unravel.
Yeah.
Emma, you've got your hand up.
Hello, yes. I'm Emma. I'm from Edinburgh University, and it's been really interesting. As Sarah says, this has just been great to listen to you discuss this. I'm in the process of setting up a kind of participatory kind of research hub at the university. My background's really in childhood and youth studies. So issues of power in participatory research is something that we talk about quite a lot. And I think kind of, I guess from my research, we often have this kind of debate, exactly as you're saying, Sarah, that, you know, you want it to be as co-produced as possible. And that's almost like you're kind of aiming for a gold standard, that the more co-produced it is, the better it is. And I think from my research, I've come to realize that that's not always the case. And it's interesting to see this question about, you know, actually it's about giving people the choice of how involved or otherwise they might want to be or not want to be. And if people just want to be involved in a bit of it, then that's great. So that's really interesting reflections. And then I guess my other point was around power, and we're really talking about power as if it's, I guess, a bit two-dimensional. Power is owned by the organizations and the, I guess, the commissioners or the academics, and then the community researchers and the participants are powerless, or do you know what I mean? That it's that kind of, and certainly in youth research, that is not the case. Often we are grappling with young people resisting power, reclaiming power, and you know, different power dynamics within and between young people. So I guess I guess my point is just about trying to maybe rethink power as a more complicated and messy thing. And certainly that's my experience with children and young people, and I'm just interested as to whether that's the same in your experiences as well. Yeah, I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Emma. I wonder if there is a link with what you've just been describing and with the other dimension that we've got up on the slide here around respecting and valuing the knowledge of all those working together in research. The idea of the principle of everyone having a sort of equality of importance, and that without that it weakens the process. But with this, with these values being exercised, it becomes a much stronger process. So you can see the questions that we've kind of put out there as a starter to think about. But I wonder if anyone would like to just kick us off with thinking about this matter of respect and valuing the knowledge of all. I mean, yes, Gillian, Kathleen, sorry.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Gillett from Macmillan Cancer Support, and I'm taking part in the workshop as I haven't done a co-produced research project before, but I'm interested in potentially doing it with a small community of women in Bristol. And I've started working with them and building trust and building relationships through a sort of mini listening project, and it's had to go digital. And I'm doing some one-to-one interviews with them at the moment about their lives, and it's very broadly under the banner of how they're feeling about their health and well-being, who they turn to and who turns to them for help with health and well-being, of course, including concerns around physical things like cancer. So I feel that I could potentially be embarking on some kind of co-production community research in the next months or year, if you like. And I did feel that it was important to build a strong relationship with these people, that I'm not part of their community, I don't live near them, and to try to get to know them and understand what affects their lives, you know. So in conjunction with the group leader, I designed quite a detailed questionnaire that's very wide-ranging about their lives, and we're in the process of recording that and then going to theme it and then ask them how they feel about what came out. So I'm hoping, I'm encouraged that I'm on the right lines of starting to get to know them and what they've been through in their lives and what's important to them in their lives before we begin to discuss if they would like to take part in community research and be researchers.
That's a really interesting stage, isn't it? Then, it sounds like the trust and relationship building perspective is a fantastic platform from which to start. I wonder if anyone else would like to come in there with some further reflections on this question about respect and valuing knowledge. Elizabeth.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm doing a PhD at Bangor University, but I've been doing it for the last 5 years. I'm still struggling to write it up. I took an action research approach to my research. So initially, I wasn't thinking in terms of co-production or terms like volunteer researchers. All the literature I was reading was using terms like participants, which was a bit passive, really. But it's still, the action research literature does talk a lot, doesn't it, about respecting and valuing the knowledge of all those working together on the research, and different forms of knowledge and experiential knowledge, and trying to get some kind of parity between the academic approach and the experiential knowledge. So when you were talking earlier, you said about, somebody said something about distinguishing between co-production and involvement, and then I think it was Emma was talking about, well, actually it's more of a spectrum, and you need to give people a choice how involved they are, whether they're involved to the extent of co-production or perhaps the other end of the extreme is a participant. And there's probably a million steps in between, isn't there? I found that was really, it was all tied up with the commissioning of the project and who we were working with. So I had two main research partners, a public services board, an amalgamation of different public bodies, and a voluntary sector organisation. And yeah, trying to give, I mean, even finding power for myself was difficult enough without enabling other people to have influence over decisions as well, because you have all these very powerful organisations that you're working with. I think perhaps who's just dropped off my screen, but the volunteer researcher who was speaking earlier was talking about the difficult project, the one that wasn't performing very well, and how much, how much they have power over what you do in your research. Anyway,
Yeah.
that was my random thoughts on this, but it is quite a spectrum, isn't it? And I'm not sure whether labels like volunteer researcher or participant or co-produce are helpful, or whether they sort of box us into particular roles.
Yeah, I think a recurrent issue that has come up in these workshops is the choice of language, and what the power of what a set of words can do to start suddenly shaping things in ways that you might not have anticipated sometimes, and shut other things off. I'm conscious of Gillian. Is there anything that we've been discussing that you would like to come in on?
I'm not currently involved in any co-production research. I've joined this workshop more kind of out of a general interest. I am involved in some co-production work as a member of an advisory forum, and I suppose I'm just kind of interested in what people are saying about that distinction between what's co-production and what's involvement. I've been involved in a meeting earlier this morning where I suppose essentially we're kind of grappling a little bit with those issues about, you know, you can have a sort of aspiration of co-production, but sometimes what people actually interpret co-production to mean is really quite variable. So having a sort of shared understanding of what co-production is also part of something that sort of underpins all this work in whether it's research or other forms of co-production, you know, just actually kind of getting that general understanding so that people are sort of singing from the same hymn sheet really is quite important. And I think that when, I think it was Sarah was talking about sort of at what stage does something become co-production, you know, and how much of an idea do you present without feeling that you've already kind of solved the issue or set the parameters around something is actually quite a tricky balance to achieve. So I suppose I'm just kind of interested in what people are saying about that, because I think they're the kind of fundamentals that you have to grapple with when you're doing any kind of co-production work.
Thank you, Gillian. Ian, did you want to say something? You look like you're on the tip of the tongue.
Just a couple of quick observations, really. I mean, in terms of Emma's point on power, an old professor of mine used to come up with a kind of truism: power's like mercury, it's not like cheese. It sort of slithers around, you know, you can't chunk it up and play so much here. And I think what Emma was saying about the fact that participants, community researchers, or however they're termed, and academics, it's a very fluid process. And of course, the power of resistance or non-response, as it might be, from participants is a very significant one, because if you get it from a lot of participants, you've got no research. So it's just worth reflecting on. And my other observation is really about for Elizabeth. I think there's a really whole issue, we're not going to have time to explore that, about the rigors of doing a PhD in terms of the conventions about what is your own knowledge, what is your contribution to knowledge, how can you identify what you have done as opposed to other people who've come before, all the participants or co-researchers. I'm not quite sure the co-production has been inserted into that discussion as much as it should be for someone like yourself doing an individual PhD, which will be subject to a particular mode of evaluation at the end of the day. So that probably doesn't help you, but I think it is an important question more widely.
It was helpful, actually, thanks, Ian, because it made me remember that there were times when I wanted the Board of Trustees to take an active role in the research, but they treated me like a consultant. You come in and tell us what the answers are. And then, I think that was quite a significant thing to find out, that they were expecting me to know what to do. I don't. They're the ones with the knowledge and the expertise.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so then we are rejoining the rest of the group. Has anyone got a final point that they would like to put in? I didn't mean to shut down the conversation in that way. I think there's something about the often these statements that, you know, you find when you put them into practice, they do become a lot more fluid and messy and up for negotiation. And so sometimes the toolkit sort of guidance, and I think our guidance might be the case, is it can be a bit simplistic.
Welcome back, everyone. I think that's everyone back from all of their rooms. No one is stuck in the internet, I don't think, which is great. I hope you had good discussions in those rooms. And we just have a few minutes sort of now really for the facilitators of those rooms, if you just want to feed back a couple of the main points that you discussed to give the other groups a bit of a flavour. It's up to you who wants to go first. Carly, do you want to, as you were in room 1?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So what we talked about was the recruitment of researchers, and obviously there's a lot that goes into this, and we noted that there are differences between how Torbay did that and how Bristol did that. So we have very different experiences, as well a lot of the other Age and Better areas. But we were talking about where to recruit and when is appropriate and how you actually recruit. We talked about how in Bristol we recruited the researchers before any projects were really running. So some people, there was a bit of a dropout because, you know, people came in expecting to start doing the interviews, start doing the work, getting right down to it. But then there was a bit of a lag time because we didn't have the projects running yet. That was obviously a big learning for us. And, you know, I know it was different from the other Age and Better areas, and there might, you know, not be a perfect example of how to do it or when, but we know that we would have probably done it a bit differently in Bristol. And one key thing we talked about is also making sure that the recruitment information, the flyer, any wording around what the researchers are going to be doing, that's really key to make sure that it talks about the fluidity of the role as well. We talked about things like, you know, being able to do questionnaires and interviews and kind of taking on a lot of different aspects of a research role. And that wasn't always conveyed in the first initial recruitment documents because it might not have always been known that that's what the role was going to become. And we thought one of the, you know, great parts of the Aging Better program was that there is that flexibility with funding, and we had that for projects, and we also had that for the research and evaluation, but that sometimes that means that things weren't conveyed appropriately and we didn't have it right from the beginning, if you want to say. So we weren't able to kind of explain exactly what the research role was going to entail really. But there's obviously a lot from the interviews and the questionnaires and writing as well. And we also talked about importance of really representing the community that you're working with, and making sure that you have that kind of creative space to have enough different opinions and attitudes and people kind of representing different aspects of that community as well, to make sure that you kind of get a full evaluation. And also noting about the motivation for why people want to be a researcher. You know, I think that's key for also retaining and that momentum and keeping that going and keeping people in the program for as long as they did really, and as long as they would in the future. So making sure that you really understand people's motivation, their interests, their passions, why they were there, what they're interested in. And even if that does mean kind of breaking down the roles into different smaller sub roles, just to make sure that everybody stays interested and happy and keen to keep doing that work for you. So yeah, those are some of our top conversation tips.
Amazing, thank you. And how about you, Donna? You were in room 2.
Yep, so this is all about ethical and safeguarding considerations. So firstly, we kind of run through safeguarding volunteer researchers and you know what happens if researchers are lone working. In Bristol, there was a policy around kind of messaging someone after the lone working, but that wasn't often followed through. And in Torbay we had everyone working in pairs, so that wasn't quite as necessary, but we did also have a policy of checking in with Serio at the university to ensure that everything had gone all right and that they were okay and that the participants were okay as well. So just making sure that there is a clear framework really for what happens after the piece of research has been done, to make sure that you know everyone is okay, but make something that Penny and Christine really honed in on is having that policy right from the very beginning, being really clear on who they should phone and what happens that person doesn't phone the university or whoever is leading the research, what happens then, who do they contact, and so on and so forth. So having it really, really clearly laid out. We talked about safeguarding information, so having this, you know, really clear process about, you know, what happens to any information that's gathered during the co-production of research. You know, thinking about GDPR, what happens, you know, do we shred any bits of paper that researchers have? How does that happen? Who does that? Whose responsibility is that? So just really, really thinking about that. We talked about being DBS checked. So in Torbay, our researchers were DBS checked. I'm not sure that happened in Bristol, but then I think that there were kind of different levels of work of who the researchers were working with, and so just having that kind of further checks to make sure that everyone is safe. Then we kind of ran through ethical issues relating to research participants, and really this focused on the importance of informed consent, and making sure that those participants really know what they are signing up for, and if everything and that everything is being done in the best interest of those participants. So we talked about individuals who may not have the mental or mental capacity to provide informed consent, and what do we do in those instances. I don't believe that there were any instances with Torbay and Bristol, but you know, what should happen as a result of that? What, you know, if that is going to be the case, who do you go to? How do you get that informed consent? And then finally, just considerations to the research methods in terms of volunteers knowing participants. In Torbay, we had instances where participants were known to our researchers. Torbay is a really small, like relatively small area where lots of people know lots of people, so we made sure that nobody knew anyone, because just to make sure that the research was unbiased. And if, you know, if we have contact details to make sure that those are shredded, and that nobody holds any personal data that they shouldn't be holding.
Amazing, thank you. I find that issue really interesting around whether or not, yeah, you know the person that you're interviewing. But just keeping an eye on time. Matt, do you probably have like 1 minute or so if you can summarise probably what was a very complicated topic in your breakout room. Oh, you're on mute.
So we had we had influence and decision making, and we had a good mix of CRs, NGOs, academics, new and experienced, and I think we got pretty quickly to the theme of power as fluid, complex and messy. Power is like mercury, not like cheese, and that as a consequence, quite a few of the sorts of guidance that is often put in place is a simplification of something that is a lot more rolling and complicated. Nevertheless, the principles around building trust and building relationships seem to be really important. The idea that more co-production in everything isn't automatically better, and sometimes people's abilities to not take on responsibilities and not have certain kind of things that they have to do is quite freeing up for some people and gives a bit of flexibility in the areas they wish. We talked about how that there may be, everyone may be starting from a point of relative ignorance sometimes, and so it's not always too clear about being able to be transparent. And sometimes we're not always aware that we are or are not being transparent. So it goes back to issues of trust and relationship as being absolutely pivotal in this area. And we also talked quite a lot about, there's lots of learning from fields of action research, youth and children-based research that can be transferred into the realm of thinking about working particularly with older people and community researchers. So lots of transferable knowledge that we can bring in from elsewhere.
Brilliant. I look forward to listening to your conversations back afterwards. And just handing over back to Carly now for a close.
Great, thank you, Claire. And thank you so much for everybody who attended today. Obviously, there was a lot of going on in the breakout rooms, so it's amazing that we had that space to have the conversations. But we know this was really short and brief, and some of these conversations you could talk about for so much longer and really want to delve into more depth, really. So, that's when things like using the toolkit is going to be a great resource to actually be able to access that when it launches, use that, bring that back to your organizations to have kind of deeper conversations around this going forward, as well as being able to go to the panel discussion later today if you can. And if you can right now, if you have any other questions that were not answered in the discussions, please do put them in the chat now, and then Claire will bring those to the panel discussions later. And that's how we'll be able to answer some more of your questions as well. Or also feel free to get in touch with us at BAB or Torbay, just to see if you have other questions for us specifically. And then thank you so much for coming.